It's wonderful to be in worship with you this morning. We are continuing our series, Tales of the Sea. In this series, we're looking at stories that take place around or on the Sea of Galilee. And all of these stories are important, not just because they're in the New Testament. Of course, that makes them important. But they're important because from the very earliest church, when these stories began to circulate, they spoke to people who were striving to follow Jesus in their particular situation in a way that gave them hope, encouragement, and also challenged them. And that wasn't true just for the earliest church, but it remains true for us today. Because the message of each story is a message that's relevant to us, that speaks to us in our situation today. Look at the calling of the disciples that we looked at first in this series. When Jesus called them to those fishermen who were professionals at fishing to go and fish for people, the message for us is that Jesus calls us to use the gifts and graces and talents we have, to use them in a new and expanded way, in a way that blesses the lives of others, in a way that blesses our world. And so we understand that when Jesus called them, Jesus likewise calls us. When Jesus took the loaves and the fish and multiplied them so that they were enough, that story is a message to us that is relevant today. Jesus takes what we offer, and it's enough and more than enough to bless others. It's enough and more than enough to meet the needs. And today we look at another story, another tale of the sea, if you will. And it's an odd story to modern ears. It's the story of Jesus walking on the water, on the surface of the Sea of Galilee. It's one of those stories that's made its way into popular speech and expressions, into jokes and humor. People will speak in a way, or use that as an image when they're talking about somebody who is sort of bigger than life, or seems to be perfect, or great. And so there are stories that abound, probably most of them apocryphal. One of those is that Mrs. Bear Bryant's wife, answered the phone one day, and someone said, "Oh, may I speak to the great Bear Bryant?" And she said, "Well, I can get him in a moment. Right now he's out taking his morning stroll on the lake." It's stories like that make their way. People who talk about, he's such a proud grandfather that he says the grandchild's first steps were on the bathtub water, that kind of thing. But for the earliest church, this was a serious story. Serious not because it happened 30 or 40 years before then, not because they could look back and see that event. It was serious in a different kind of way, in a way that asked the right kind of questions of this story. It's our tendency, as we talked about last week, it's our tendency to ask the Western mindset, the sort of scientific questions. We want to know the how could this happen? And those are the kinds of questions that lead us down a path that's not very helpful. It leads us down a path of kind of a fundamentalism that has no real imagination, and that kind of leaves us stuck in that time and place. Or it can lead us down the path of all sorts of imagining, there was a sandbar out there Jesus was walking on, or he was close to the shore and the disciples didn't realize where they were. Those kinds of conjectures that just aren't very helpful at all. They're not the right questions. The right questions for this story is, what does it mean for us today? The right questions are, what does it say to us about Christ, about our nature, and about the relationship with Christ? And how does that speak to us as people who are striving to be followers of Jesus in this day and time? That's the question. It's the question of that earliest church. Because think about them. They were rowing into the wind. They were striving to be God's people in a world that did not welcome them, in fact, that often persecuted them. They were striving to follow Jesus and to be faithful, but they experienced tremendous storms and great headwinds in that earliest church. And so when they read these words to one another, when they told these words to one another, it was by way of encouragement and challenge. And so it is for us today. Because we ask the right questions, and then we have the answers that speak to us in our day and time. You remember the story. We heard it just a moment ago. Jesus, after the feeding of the 5,000, immediately after that event, Jesus goes off to himself to pray up on a hillside. He sends the disciples over to the other side of the lake. He goes off to pray by himself, perhaps because he is grieving. He has just learned of the death of his cousin John. And he goes off to himself to pray, to think. The disciples are making their way to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, but they have terrible waves that are battering the boat. In fact, the Greek says that it's tormenting or torturing the boat, these waves are, and the wind is blowing against them. They're rowing into a headwind. It's difficult work, and it's nighttime. What they're experiencing is what St. John of the Cross would call the dark night of the soul. What writers down through the ages have called that dark period or dark night of the soul that every person in this room, I'm guessing, has experienced at one time or another. It's that time of darkness in your life when you don't know what's ahead. You don't know how you're going to get there. You're rowing as hard as you can, but you don't seem to be making any headway. The storms of life are battering against you. The dark night of the soul. And the one emotion that stands out in the dark night of the soul is fear. Fear that blinds even the disciples to be able to recognize Jesus when he comes to them. They think he's a ghost and they're terrified. In fact, so terrified are they that they scream, it says, because they are consumed by fear. Fear is part of the dark night of the soul. It's whatever brings that about, whether it's that phone call in the middle of the night, whether it's the loss of a job, whether it's the death of a loved one, whether it's the impending death of one we love, it's that terrible diagnosis that comes, the loss of a friend, whatever it is, those periods of doubt that shake us to our core. Fear looms large in those times. In fact, fear looms large in general, I think, for us right now. Someone listed all of the phobias that we have, and you're familiar with the common phobias, fear of heights, acrophobia, agoraphobia, fear of the marketplace or open spaces, claustrophobia, fear of closed spaces and all of that. But there's been a lot of talk about pantophobia, which is fear of everything. It is being consumed by fear, where there's fear when it's not even clear what you're afraid of. Fear that can so stimulate our imaginations in a negative way that fear begins to feed on itself. So there are fears about the nation, fears about the world, fears about our family, fears about the United Methodist Church, fears about this and that and the other, and those fears can feed on themselves and can be corrosive in our lives. The disciples are afraid because that's what happens in these storm-tossed, dark nights of the soul. And Jesus comes to them. But that fear is something that you and I experience as well. Fear that can lead us to imagine the worst. I think about the character Sancho Panza in Don Quixote. He spends all night hanging by his fingertips from a window ledge, only to discover when morning dawns that his toes are 1 inch above the ground. But he's terrified. He's hanging there. He's paralyzed by his fear. What causes it? It's his imagination. It's only his imagination of what's underneath. It's his imagining a great chasm, a long distance to fall, and it paralyzes him. I've shared with some of you that right now my mother is in hospice care and not doing well. And my sister and Susan and I were sitting in her home a couple of nights ago, and we were talking about all that was going on. And as we were talking and as we were thinking about what's ahead, I said to the group, I said, you know, if Mike were here, Mike is my brother who passed away last year. I said, if Mike were here, I know exactly what he would say to us. He would say, don't make movies. He used to tell me that when I was talking about the future in a way that I was apprehensive or fearful and began to talk about all the bad things that might happen in a particular situation. That's what he always said to me. I remember the first time he said it, don't make movies. I looked at him. Sometimes Mike could be a little bit like a Zen master. He would say something like that and just let it hang there. So I said, what do you mean don't make movies? And he just said, don't make movies. Okay, what do you mean don't make movies? And he said, what you're doing right now is you're making a movie about the future. And he said, they're always horror stories. They're horror films. Don't do that, he said. You're letting your fear make a movie in your mind that is almost certainly not going to come to pass. He's right. But fear does that to us. It can take us down a path of imagination that is not helpful. The disciples were in that place, tossed and trying to by the storm and trying to make their way forward. They don't know what's ahead. They're terrified. So afraid are they, so clouded is their judgment, so clouded is their imagination that they think Jesus is a ghost. And he comes and he says words that are repeated over and over and over and over again in Scripture. And those words are, don't be afraid. Have faith. Be confident. It's me. I'm with you. He comes to them in their time of greatest need, in their time of fear, in that dark night. They're not alone. Now, I want you to go back to the early church and imagine that message to them. You're not alone in this. It looks like there's no future, but there's a future. It looks like you're making no headway, but you are. It looks like you're in this all by yourself, but you're not. There is that reminder that Jesus is present with them. And the three Gospels that include this story all make that point. Don't be afraid. I am with you. That's in Mark, that's in Matthew, and that's in John. Luke doesn't have this story. But Matthew goes farther. He has another message for us. Because it's only in Matthew that Simon Peter is featured in the way that he is. Because in Matthew, Simon Peter says to Jesus, if it's really you, still not sure about that. If it's really you, order me, command me to come to you on the water. Now, that's a fascinating thing for Simon Peter to say. Simon Peter's great. You've heard me say it before. Simon is one of my favorites because Simon's always the first to speak, whether he's right or wrong. He often doesn't get it, but he speaks anyway. And And sometimes he puts his foot in his mouth, and sometimes he gets in trouble. Sometimes he gets it right, but he's going to say something, and it's going to be bold quite often. And so he says, order me to come to you. I think what's going on with Simon Peter is Simon Peter really wants to be like Jesus in every way that he can. And he desires that. And he doesn't quite know how to get there, but he wants to be obedient. So he says, you order me to do that, and I'll do it. And I like that. I like that kind of boldness. Almost a recklessness. A willingness to step out in faith and to risk. In fact, you think about it, most of the great things that happen because somebody stepped out in faith. Somebody risks. Almost all of the important things, almost all of the great discoveries or the great challenges that have been met by that stepping out on faith. Simon wants to do that, and so he steps out of the boat, and astoundingly, he does the impossible. And he's focused on Jesus, and he begins to walk toward Jesus, but then he looks around, and he sees the waves, and he sees the effects of the wind, and he hears the roar, and he becomes afraid. And he begins to sink like his nickname, which is Rock. The word Peter means rock, Petros. He begins to sink. I think there's a message for us there. The message is Jesus is always calling us out of the boat, calling us to do a great thing, calling us to go where we would not otherwise go, calling us to go beyond our level of comfort, calling us to do the right thing even if it hurts or is painful or perhaps costs us more than we want to pay. Jesus is always calling us, and we step out in faith, and then it becomes very important where our focus is. Because it's so easy in seeking to follow Jesus to be distracted and to become fearful. I don't know about you, but there are times when I take a sabbatical from 24-hour news. Do you ever do that? You ought to do that. Because the 24-hour news cycle, talk about taking us down the path of fear. I mean, it's that constant bad news. It's the constant fear that is instilled in us in that. It's just, it's hard not to go there. It's hard to remain focused on the good in the world, and it's hard to remain focused on the good that we're called to do. It's hard to remain focused on the ways in which God's at work in the world and all the good people that are faithfully following in the way of Christ and doing good. And so we need to take a break from that from time to time. Because that's the kind of distraction, the loss of focus that leads to a kind of sinking when we're trying to be faithful and do a courageous and important thing that God has called us to do. Jesus calls us to step out on faith. And this story speaks to us today in a powerful way because you and I know that there are ways in which Christ is calling us right now to be God's person in the world. And it may be uncomfortable. It may be in a way that we think is impossible or we can't do it. It may be a call to love that person that really seems impossible to love, to forgive what seems impossible to forgive, to serve in a way that seems to go beyond my abilities and my talents or your abilities and talents. And yet Jesus calls us to step out on faith. And that requires focus on who Christ calls us to be and focus on Christ. I really think Simon wanted to be like Jesus. I think that's who Christ calls us to be. To be like him in the way we love and serve and live. And I believe if we're seeking to follow Jesus, that's who we want to be. I think we want to say to Jesus, command me to step out in faith as you do, and I'll do it. Let's pray. Oh God, at our best, we have courage, and we step out in faith to be your people in all the ways you call us to be. At our best, we are focused on Christ and following him. And at our best, we are confident that no matter what, we are not alone. We know, God, that sometimes we falter, we become distracted, we become fearful. The good news is you always reach down and lift us up when we are sinking. Oh God, this morning, I pray that you would lift up any brother or sister who is sinking under the weight of fear and care. Set them safely in the boat, knowing they're not alone in the boat, but surrounded by others and in your presence. Bring peace and strength and hope. In Jesus' name, amen.